How do operating systems boot from USB drives? Imagine turning on your computer and suddenly running a different version of Windows or Linux without installing it on your hard drive. How does that happen? Well, it all starts with the boot process. When you power up your computer, the firmware, either basic input-output system or unified extensible firmware interface, begins checking your hardware. It looks for a device that has a valid bootloader, which is like a tiny program that starts the operating system. To boot from a USB drive, you need to tell the firmware to look there first. You do this by changing the boot order in the BIOS or UEFI settings, putting the USB drive above the internal hard drive. Once the firmware recognizes the USB as a bootable device, it reads the first sector of the USB, called the boot sector, or the FI executable if your system uses UEFI. This contains the bootloader, which is responsible for loading the operating system kernel into memory. The bootloader then takes over and begins the process of initializing the OS. Creating a bootable USB involves copying the operating system files onto the device in a special way. You need to include the bootloader and system files in a format that the firmware can recognize. Tools like Rufus for Windows or the DD command for Linux help prepare the USB so it's bootable. Different operating systems handle this process with some variations. For Windows, you might use tools to create a Windows Preinstallation Environment or a full Windows to go setup. These bootloaders support both BIOS and UEFI modes, but UEFI is more common today. Linux usually comes as live USBs, which let you run the OS without installing it. Linux uses bootloaders like GRUB that support both BIOS and UEFI. Macs also support booting from USB drives, but they use a different firmware system. To select the USB on a Mac, you hold down the Option key at Startup and choose the drive. Booting from a USB is useful for installing or repairing an operating system, running diagnostics, testing a new OS without affecting your current setup, or carrying a portable OS environment. The entire process depends on the firmware recognizing and loading the bootloader from the USB, which then launches the operating system stored there. This flexibility makes it easier to troubleshoot, install, or try new systems without needing to alter your main computer's internal storage.